Go through this very quickly. There's a lot of stuff that I'm going to get covered this morning. The first is I want to make sure that you understand that you're here to be a little bit disturbed. At least that is my goal this morning. I actually wrote a blog post a couple months ago. It was called Willing to be Affirmed or Willing to be Disturbed. And what I find in education is that most people, I think, want to be affirmed. That's not really what I do. I'm going to try to make you a little disturbed. And I love this essay by Margaret Wheatley, which is called Willing to be Disturbed, where she says basically, we don't get out of our comfort zones enough. We don't like to spend time not knowing. And so what I want to do is when you walk out of here today, hopefully you will know less than when you walked in. And I know that's kind of a difficult goal to achieve, but I'm going to try to really push you hard. I have a tendency of pushing hard. Sometimes I think I push a little bit too hard, as I'll show you here in a second. But I just want to welcome you to an hour or so of disturbance, if that works for you. I did find this about a month ago, though. Someone had tweeted the fact that apparently in some audiences I do develop some sense of seething rage about the things that I talk about. I just want you to know that's not my goal today. I don't want you to walk out here angry. But I do want you walking out of here thinking a little bit. Now, I know this is a Chinese curse. We live in interesting times, and certainly as a resident of the United States, these are very interesting times for us. But they are interesting times, I think, for all of us, and I do think that as the Brookings Institution suggested last year, these may be among the most disruptive times that we can ever imagine. I'm not sure historically where this is going to put us. I'm not going to be around in 50 or 100 years when people kind of write the stories of these first couple of decades of the 21st century, but there's no question that we are living at a moment when change is happening very, very quickly. And I love that last line in terms of institutions can barely keep up. And I do think if we are in institutions right now, we need to be feeling that. I'm always interested when I go to schools and people talk as if, oh yeah, it's not really a big deal. We're doing really well. We're just going to keep doing what we're doing. We're going to make it better. Yeah, we feel like we're keeping up. Ask anybody in media and journalism and politics and business whether they're keeping up right now. And I think you'll get some interesting answers. But by and large in education, the people who I speak with are kind of like, yeah, it's all good. We'll figure it out as we go. I'm not sure we will, because I do think, and I like this phrase, we're between stories. We have this traditional story of what education looks like. And there's this new emerging modern story of what it's going to be, and we're not sure exactly what that's going to look like yet, but we do know that it's happening. And if you want a really great book that I just came across a couple weeks ago, this is by the same person who wrote the book Sapiens, but he has another book called 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, where he talks extensively about the issues with education right now. But as he suggests here, we haven't really embraced that new story yet. We don't know what it is. But I think there's less and less argument that that new story is coming. And our education story is going to be rewritten. And the question becomes then, basically, who's going to do that? Now, this is hard. This is really hard, and people struggle with this. In fact, I've had a couple of conversations with people who I've seen in my visits over the years. They were here this morning, and I asked, how are things going? And they go, this is really hard. It's very, very difficult to make this happen. And I love this cartoon that I found a couple months ago, where it feels like in education, we like to cue ourselves up for the convenient lies, but we don't like to grapple too much with the unpleasant truths. And I think everyone in this room knows there are some unpleasant truths about education that we really don't want to talk about too much, some common sense things, or some things that we do that defy common sense. So I want you to, hopefully today, kind of swim in that unpleasant truth category and ask this question. You know, what is the new story of education that we're writing? And importantly, who is writing it? I find that question, that's a whole other presentation, right? Who is it that is beginning to write this new narrative? And what are their motivations? Are their motivations really around making money? Or are their motivations around what's doing best for kids or whatever else? But I can tell you that this new story is not about knowing stuff. That I know for sure. The knowing stuff narrative about schools, that is disappearing because that stuff is now everywhere. And so much of it that we think in schools that kids need to know, they just don't need to know that any longer. And I don't think it's about teaching. It's not necessarily about us becoming better teachers, better practitioners in the traditional sense. I think this entire story, all of it, is about learning. It's all about learning. It's all about the way we think about learning, the way we understand learning, and most importantly, how learning happens in the modern world. Because learning in the modern world is not the same. Learning is the same, but the way it happens in the modern world is increasingly different and very, very challenging if we go there to the constructs, the systems, and the structures that we have in schools by and large. So I love Seymour Papert. He's one of the people who has influenced my thinking about this tremendously. And he says, the only competitive skill today is the ability to learn. That's the only thing that will allow you to thrive today. Howard Gardner, who I know has spoken at this convention or at this conference before, also suggests that it is about people who make a lifelong commitment to learning constantly. And by the way, that learning is not explicit. It is not so often as we move forward in traditional settings where there is a teacher and there are students and there is a curriculum. But it's more learning on demand. It's more learning that is self-determined. It's learning in a way that the people at Google headquarters call it developing learning animals, which I like that phrase. I think that's really interesting. And I want you to think in your heads right now a picture of what would learning animal kids look like? What would learning animal students look like if you saw them in your heads? I doubt they would look like that. I doubt that's the picture that we get in our heads when we think of that metaphor, when we think of these ideas going out, these kids going out and just learning kind of voraciously on their own. So, what is learning? That is the question. And Christoph mentioned that in the introduction. That is the question that kind of drives my professional life and also my learning life right now. What is it? How do we define it? How does it manifest itself in schools? How do we understand it, especially in education? Because learning is our work, right? If our kids aren't learning, then what's the point? But what's interesting to me is how many different ways people define that word. How very little coherence there is around that word when I go into schools, when I talk to teachers, and I talk to parents, and I talk to kids. And I'm going to do something here in a second that I think is going to prove that. Seymour Saracen, who wrote a great book called And What Do You Mean by Learning, says basically that there will be no change in schools that sticks until we come to some coherence and understanding about what this word means. That this is the most important question, and if we can't answer it as a school community with coherence, then we're in trouble. And Saracen says what's interesting to him about that question is that it makes people really kind of nervous. Whenever you ask that, or whenever I go up and ask people, they kind of go, well, I think it's, or there's not a fluid answer that emanates from most people's mouths when we have this conversation. So I kind of want to prove it, and I'd like you right now, on the count of 3, out loud, to say what you think learning is. Are you ready? 1, 2, 3. I'll wait. Okay, now I'm making a point, obviously. I'm not sure what point I'm making, but I'm making a point. And the point is, you probably heard some different things coming out of people's mouths sitting next to you. There probably wasn't one kind of general answer that we gave to that. There wasn't a lot of coherence. And I'm pretty sure that at your schools, if you got 20 people together and asked them how to define learning, you get 20 different answers. I think that's a problem. I think that's a really big problem. Because I'm going to tell you what incoherence around learning looks like, at least in my kids' lives. In my kids' lives, it meant that they had to go to block 1 and figure out what that teacher meant by learning. And once they figured that out, they had to go block 2 and figure it out all over again. Then they went to block 3, all over again, block 4, you get the idea. If we don't have coherence around what we mean by that word, that's a huge problem in the ways in which both kids and adults experience school. And so it's stunning to me on a lot of levels how few schools I've ever been to that have a clear articulation across the school community of what learning is. If you're not clear on that, how do you measure it? How do you measure what learning is if you don't share a definition of what learning is? So there are definitely consequences And I think this is the biggest problem that we have right now. You know, I started my career, my speaking career and my writing career based around technology. I wrote a book a long time ago called Blogs, Wikis, Podcasts, and Other Powerful Tools for Classrooms. And what's interesting about when I look at my own evolution, I hardly talk about technology anymore. Because technology in the service of something other than learning doesn't really matter, in schools especially. But if we're not sure on what that word means, well, that's a problem. Now, Saracen has a definition that I love. And some of you who've seen me speak, I'm sure you have seen me give this definition. But I think this is really powerful. He says basically that productive learning is the process that engenders wanting to learn more. Absent wanting to learn more, the context is unproductive. And I think if you guys all do a gut check right now and ask yourselves, what are the things that I have learned most powerfully and deeply in my life? Every single one of them is something that you wanted to learn more about. Every single one of them. But then the question becomes, basically, is that true for our kids? Is that true for our students when they leave us? Are they leaving us every single day wanting to learn more? And if they're not, what are the consequences of that? Basically, that's the question that we have to figure out. And there's lots of evidence that says if you don't want to learn more, you're going to forget it really fast as soon as this test is over. As soon as whatever the purpose is for you to learn that stuff is done, see ya. It just gets offloaded and made room for more stuff that you need to learn for some other reason than wanting to learn more about it. I had a conversation with a woman in Sydney earlier this year that just floored me. And she came up to me after my presentation. She had this really grim look on her face. And she said, I have to tell you the story. She was like, I was getting ready this morning, my kid was getting ready to go to school. He threw his backpack on her, and as he was leaving, he said, here I go to my 6-hour interruption in learning. That's how he saw school. Because he wasn't allowed to continue to learn the things that he wanted to learn more about. He wasn't allowed to go more deeply into the things that he really cared about. And if the world is about learning, maybe we should have let him do that. Maybe we should create some conditions where kids can pursue those things that they really care about. Here's another quick story about this that I find really interesting. Lawrenceville Prep, some of you may be familiar with that. It's about 20 minutes from my house in New Jersey, 3 miles from Princeton, $60,000 a year to go to Lawrenceville Prep. Basically, you send your kids there to go to Princeton. That's the idea. Now, they did an experiment a few years ago where they took a science class when they were juniors, and in June, we have exams in June, and we start school in September. So in June, when they gave them the test, the final exam in this science class, on average they got an 87, not too bad. But what they decided to do was take these same group of kids who had taken this test in June, give them the same test in September without telling them they were going to take it again, just to see how they did. And when they came back in September, they got a 58. And if they took it again the following June, they'd probably get a 30. And I wonder how many of you would be willing to do the same experiment. I wonder how many of you would be willing to give those kids the test 3 months later and see how many of them wanted to learn more about what it was you were talking about. And look, you guys all know this. I taught for 22 years. I can count on one hand, maybe two, how many kids ever came up to me in class and said, hey, Mr. Richardson, can you help me learn more about the things we're talking about in class? Because I'm really interested in that. But I would need 20 hands and toes and whatever else to count the number of times kids came up to me and said, hey, Mr. R, I got an 83. What do I need to get the 2 points for a B? Got any extra credit? Is there something I can do? Because it's not about wanting to learn. It's about getting that particular score. So wanting to learn more. That's a really interesting, I think, way of thinking about this. And so, how do we develop kids? How do we put kids in situations where they want to learn more? What does that even look like? Well, I want to introduce you to my children. This is, by the way, one of, I think, 4 pictures we have of both of my kids being happy at the same time. So this doesn't happen very often. It's my daughter, Tess, my son, Tucker. Tess is 21, and this will be the only picture you see of her, because she didn't go to college. That's kind of a laugh line, people, if you want to get, like, you know. She decided to take a gap year, and she's on her third gap year now. It's turning into a gap life.